So today we're in Daniel chapter 3. Last week we started talking about the book of Daniel, and we saw that there was a king named Nebuchadnezzar. And God's people were living in this place where Nebuchadnezzar was king. And he did not believe in God, the true God. He had many other gods that they worshiped, but he did not believe in the true God. So we're watching and seeing how in this book of Daniel, God is using Daniel to show Nebuchadnezzar who he is and that he is the true God. So the story that we're going to learn about today is one that probably many of you know. If you remember last week, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and he could not figure out his dream. And so he had asked all the wise men in his land and they could not interpret it. So he was going to kill all of them. And then someone, Daniel, heard about it. And he was able to pray and ask God to show him the meaning of the dream. And he was able to go before Nebuchadnezzar and tell him the dream. So if you remember at the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is, he says something about Daniel's God. He says, "And he fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, 'Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. For you have been able to reveal this mystery.'" So we acknowledge that, wow, that showed Nebuchadnezzar how great God was. And so while he did make that acknowledgement, we're going to see in chapter 3, he doesn't yet really understand who the true God is. Because what chapter 3 begins with, if you were to read chapter 3, I would encourage you to do that this week, says, "King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold." So you remember his dream about the statue. So it's almost like maybe this made him think about, oh, I should build a statue. So it was like he was taking God, Daniel's God, and saying, oh, they have a God. Let's add it into all of our other gods that we worship. And so they had this statue, very large statue made. And Nebuchadnezzar was going to make everyone worship it, bow down. Well, we know that God says that there are no other gods and no other gods should be worshipped. So that went directly against one of God's commandments. And so Daniel's three friends. Now, another part of the story you might find in Daniel 3, there's not really a mention of Daniel in this part of the story. I think what happens at the end of chapter 2 is Daniel and his friends are maybe put in different parts because they're helping rule for the king. And so maybe our notes about this said that Daniel was probably just somewhere else at this time, helping to lead in another area. So his three friends are there. And so you know this part of the story. There's a big idol. I'm going to show you this little picture in our book. We have this picture where you can see just the feet of the golden image. And they are supposed to bow down to it. He makes a decree. And these three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, know that they can't do that. That goes against what God's word says. And they want to just worship the one true God. And so they know they're going to have to make a decision. And it could mean there would be some kind of consequence for this. But they had enough faith, they trusted in God, and knew that they could worship God. And they could not bow down to this idol. So you know, many of you know this story, and you know that that's exactly what they did. When they were called, everyone was supposed to bow down. These three did not bow down. And if you remember, it made Nebuchadnezzar very angry when he heard that there were people, foreigners, that did not obey. And so I want to kind of show you in chapter 3 There's a part where when he is very angry about that, in verse 15, I want to read this part to you. I'm going to start in verse 13. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So he is questioning, who could you possibly worship that can be stronger than me? Because Nebuchadnezzar says, you heard what I said to do. I said to bow down to this idol. You did not. I specifically said, if anyone does not, they would be thrown in the fiery furnace. And now you're standing here before me, and you did not do that. So what am I going to do to you? I'm going to have you thrown in the fiery furnace. And so he's saying, how are you going to escape this? And do you think those three men knew? They probably did not know how God was going to work that out, but they were trusting that God would save them, that he would protect them in some way. And so because Nebuchadnezzar is so upset in verse 19, he was filled with fury, and his expression on his face changed, and he ordered the furnace to be heated even hotter than it usually was. Now, fire burns you. It doesn't matter how hot it is. It always burns. But he was so upset, he was making it even worse. And so we know, I'll show you one more picture from our book, because we know that even in the fiery furnace, God chooses to protect them. And Nebuchadnezzar was so shocked, because even it tells us that the men who had to throw them in to the fire furnace actually were killed because they got so close to the fire. Yet these three went into the furnace, and people could see from a distance looking in, they could see them in there. And it says that they saw a fourth man, and it was like he was the son of the gods. And so we think that maybe that was actually Christ there with them. It could have been an angel. The Bible doesn't tell us for sure, but we do know that God was using this for Nebuchadnezzar to see who he really was, that he was a God like no other God. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to add this God of Daniel to his other bunch of gods that he worshipped, but no, God alone is the one true God, and he is powerful. He can save like no other God. And so chapter 3 is this whole story about the fiery furnace. Now, that is a very interesting story, but I think I want you to remember that the whole purpose of that story is that Nebuchadnezzar, God is showing Nebuchadnezzar who he is. And so Nebuchadnezzar at the end is realizing, wow, there is no other God able to rescue in this way. This is what he says at the end of Daniel chapter 3. And so the big point of that is this is God showing that his salvation for all people He's the only one that can provide that. He's the only one that can save. And so God is again showing Nebuchadnezzar the truth about who he is. So we get to read about this awesome display of God's power, but remember, it was showing Nebuchadnezzar who God was. And so we want to be reminded of who God is, and that we should be trusting in the God who is all powerful, that can save, and he is the only one that can save. And we want to be trusting in him for everything in our life, everything that happens to us. We can rest in who God is.